Some houses aren't built for living, they're built for payback. They block sunlight, steal views, and squeeze into impossible spaces just to make life harder for someone else. These are spite houses, and they've been fueling neighborhood wars for centuries. From a sliver of a home in Marblehead that ruined a harbor view, to a New York strip of apartments wedged against a rival's windows, to a Buenos Aires skyscraper placed to erase an aristocrat's church view, these buildings turn grudges into landmarks. This is the houses that started neighborhood wars. A spite house is a building put up to annoy or hinder someone else. Its design or placement serves no real need for the person who built it, other than to make a point or cause trouble. This is what sets it apart from eccentric architecture. A strange-shaped house or one painted in bright colors may be unusual, but it still serves the owner's practical needs. An eccentric design might reflect personal taste, artistic vision, or a wish to stand out. A spite house, by contrast, is meant to block a neighbor's light, block their view, limit their access, or send a message of defiance. It is not about creativity for its own sake, but about creating a physical obstacle. One common reason for building a spite house is to block light. In most parts of the United States, property owners have no automatic right to sunlight entering their property from across a neighbor's land. A person who owns a vacant lot next to you can build up to the legal limits, even if the structure throws your garden into shade. This is why spite houses that block light can exist without violating most building codes, as long as they meet height limits, setbacks, and other zoning rules. Another reason is to block a view. People often assume that if they have a nice view from their window, it is theirs to keep. In the US, that is usually not the case. Unless a property owner has a legal agreement called a negative easement that limits what a neighbor can build, the neighbor is free to put up a structure that changes or removes the view. Spite houses can also act as a nuisance. For example, a person might place a narrow structure along a shared boundary, painted in unpleasant colors, or with windows placed to invade privacy. The nuisance might not break the law if it does not cause physical damage or direct harm, but it still affects the neighbor's enjoyment of their own land. In other cases, a spite house is symbolic. Someone might build it to show they refuse to cooperate with a neighbor, family member, or even a local authority. For instance, a landowner in a dispute over an easement might build a wall-like house along the disputed area to make a statement that they will not yield. The U.S. legal context makes spite houses possible in many situations because property law does not give people general rights to light, air, or view across someone else's land. Negative easements can protect those rights, but they must be agreed to in writing and recorded against the property. Without such an agreement, a property owner can often build as they please within the rules. A case called Cody v. Ramsey Associates, Inc. illustrates the point. In that case, a property owner objected to a neighbor's plan that would block views. The court confirmed that, under common law, no general right to an unobstructed view exists. The decision reinforced the idea that unless a person has a specific legal protection, they cannot stop a neighbor from building something that changes the light or view. Some cities and states have zoning rules that limit extreme spite construction, but these rules usually address dimensions, setbacks, and safety, not motive. If a spite house meets building code, zoning law, and safety standards, the fact that it was built out of malice is often not enough to stop it. Courts in the U.S. tend to avoid making rulings based on motive alone when the action itself is within the legal rights of the property owner. This approach is not universal. In countries that follow a civil law tradition, there may be direct limits on malicious construction. Finland, for example, bans building that is clearly intended to harm a neighbor. The law there treats such action as an abuse of property rights. If a person puts up a structure with no real purpose other than to interfere with someone else's use of their property, a court can order it removed. Civil law systems often include concepts of good faith and reasonableness in how property rights are used. This means that even if the structure meets building standards, the motive and effect can make it unlawful. Imagine two scenarios to see the difference. In Boston in the late 19th century, one owner built a 4-story house only 10 feet wide to block a relative's larger home after an inheritance dispute. It was legal because it met the city's building rules, and the courts did not require a valid personal use beyond lawful construction. Under Finland's law, that same act might be struck down if a court found no reasonable need for the structure except to cause harm. In another example, a homeowner in the U.S. might put up a tall wall right at the property line, blocking a neighbor's afternoon sun. Without a negative easement or a specific local rule, the neighbor has little legal recourse, even if the wall exists solely out of spite. These differences show why spite houses are more often discussed in U.S. property law than in some other countries. In the U.S., the focus is on defined rights and agreements, not on whether the property owner acted in good faith. In civil law jurisdictions, the concept of abuse of rights means that using property in a way that is legal in form but malicious in purpose can still be unlawful. This gives courts more freedom to stop or remove spite houses. Spite houses sit at the edge of property law, where personal motives meet the boundaries of legal rights. In the U.S., their legality usually depends on whether the structure violates a specific rule, easement, or covenant. In many civil law countries, their legality depends on whether the owner has a reasonable, good faith use for the building. The difference comes down to how each system balances the right to use property against the duty not to harm others through that use. The Old Spite House in Marblehead, Massachusetts, is one of the best-known early American examples of a building created out of personal conflict rather than simple need. The story goes that two brothers inherited a piece of land from their father. They disagreed about how to divide it. One brother built a normal-sized house on his share. The other, still angry about how the inheritance had been handled, built a house so narrow that it appeared almost like a wall. The house measured only a few feet wide at certain points and stretched lengthwise along the property, blocking the other brother's view of the harbor. In an era when the harbor view carried real economic value as well as social prestige, the choice was calculated to hurt. The structure met the building rules of the time and was habitable, but its placement and dimensions made it clear the builder's goal was not comfort. This narrow shape still stands today, serving as a reminder that property disputes in colonial and early post-colonial America could play out in bricks and boards. In Frederick, Maryland, the Tyler Spite House came about under a different kind of tension. In 1814, the city planned to widen a street to improve traffic flow. Under local rules at the time, the city could not seize land that contained a substantial structure without compensating the owner, and even then, the process would be costly and slow. Dr. John Tyler owned a corner lot that would have been affected by the expansion. Instead of waiting for the city to act, he arranged for construction to begin at once. Legend holds that workers completed enough of the outer walls in a single night to qualify as a standing structure under the law. Whether it was one night or several days, the effect was the same. The city could not easily claim the land for the street project. The resulting house had an unusual shape, fitting tightly into the edge of the lot and extending into what might otherwise have become public roadway. Its projecting bays and close fit to the street suggest that its main purpose was to occupy space rather than provide a generous living area. This case shows how legal loopholes and quick action could be used to block public works in the early 19th century. The Hollinsbury Spite House in Alexandria, Virginia, arose from a smaller scale but persistent irritation. In the 1830s, John Hollinsbury owned property next to a narrow alley that ran between two streets. This alley was used by horse-drawn wagons, and according to local accounts, the constant traffic caused damage to the walls of Hollinsbury's home. The noise and intrusion also made the space less private. To solve the problem, he built a house directly into the alley, closing it off entirely. The resulting building was only about 7 feet wide, running from one street to the other. Its walls included sections of the neighboring structures, showing that the point was to fill a gap rather than create a freestanding house from scratch. By sealing off the alley, Hollinsbury stopped the traffic, ended the damage to his walls, and claimed the land for himself. The building remains one of the narrowest houses in America, and a clear example of using construction to end a nuisance. These three examples show different motives within the same broad idea. In Marblehead, the cause was a personal feud between relatives, played out by blocking a valuable view. In Frederick, the driver was resistance to a municipal plan, carried out by occupying land before the city could take it. In Alexandria, the issue was a practical complaint about damage and noise, resolved by removing a public right-of-way. All three used construction as a tool to achieve goals unrelated to normal residential needs. The old Spite House in Marblehead also reflects the flexibility of building practices in early New England towns. Lots were not always uniform in size, and building codes were less standardized. A person could put up a habitable structure on a narrow footprint as long as it was safe and stable. There was little concern for preserving a neighbor's view or ensuring that buildings had a certain width. This allowed someone with a grievance to design a house that was legal in every technical sense, but still targeted in its effect. The Tyler Spite House shows how understanding local ordinances could be used to prevent changes in the built environment. Street widening projects were common in growing towns, but they often met resistance from property owners who stood to lose frontage or land value. By acting quickly and meeting the definition of a permanent structure, a landowner could freeze the layout of a street for decades. The house in Frederick remains a physical reminder of how one person's determination could outlast civic plans. The Hollinsbury Spite House adds another layer by blending personal benefit with public loss. Closing the alley meant better privacy and protection for Hollinsbury, but it also removed a passage used by others. In a time before motor vehicles, alleys served as important routes for local deliveries, movement of goods, and shortcuts. Blocking one could alter traffic patterns in the neighborhood. The fact that this could be done by building a narrow infill house shows how property boundaries and public rights-of-way were sometimes less rigid than today. Each of these buildings is still standing, which is unusual for structures that began as acts of defiance or irritation. Their survival means they now carry a mix of historical curiosity and architectural oddity. They also serve as case studies in how personal motives, local law, and physical space interact. In the case of Marblehead, the feud that led to the building is long over, but the form of the house still speaks to its origin. In Frederick, the blocked street remains a visible change to the city's layout. In Alexandria, the closed alley has been a private residence for generations, erasing the public path it once provided. When we look at these houses today, it is easy to see them as quirky or charming, but in their own time, they were strategic acts. The narrow proportions of the Marblehead house were not a design trend, but a calculated obstruction. The quick construction in Frederick was not about meeting a family's housing needs, but about blocking a civic project. The alley-filling structure in Alexandria was not about creating more living space, but about ending an unwanted public use. The physical forms of the buildings are shaped as much by these motives as by the practical limits of construction. These early American spite houses illustrate how much the built environment can be shaped by private disputes and local politics. They show that a building can be both lawful and provocative, fitting within the letter of the law while pushing against its spirit. They also show that the tools for such acts, narrow lots, quick construction, use of existing walls, were available in an era before modern zoning and planning. In each case, the builder left a mark not just on a neighbor's comfort or the city's plans, but on the physical landscape that endures for centuries. The Boston Skinny House is one of the most famous examples of a feud turned into architecture. The story begins with two brothers who inherited land in the north end of Boston. One brother went off to serve in the military during the Civil War. While he was away, the other brother took over most of the land, building a large home for himself. By the time the soldier returned, only a narrow strip of land remained. The returning brother believed his sibling had taken more than his fair share. Rather than sell the sliver of land or try to split it in a conventional way, he decided to make his point through construction. The result was a house only 10.4 feet wide at its widest point, tapering to even less in some places. Built tightly alongside his brother's larger home, it rose 4 stories high. The placement was deliberate. Its height and closeness cut off sunlight to the other house and blocked views from its windows. In a dense urban neighborhood where open space and light were already scarce, the effect was immediate and lasting. The narrow footprint made the interior cramped, with rooms arranged in a single file line from front to back. Stairs were steep, hallways barely wide enough for a person to walk through, and furniture had to be chosen or built to fit. The construction itself followed local building rules, which focused on safety, height, and alignment with the street, rather than on motives or neighborly fairness. No law prevented a person from building on their own land simply to spite someone else. In the absence of agreements like a negative easement, which could have restricted building in that space, the returning brother was free to use his strip as he wished. The law in Boston at the time, like most of the United States, gave no general right to light or view across a neighbor's property. The skinny house became a permanent obstacle for the larger home next door. Its windows and narrow balconies faced away from the neighbor's property, making it clear that the building was not about gaining a pleasant outlook, but about denying one to someone else. The unusual dimensions drew attention, but they also made the house difficult to live in. Its value as a dwelling was far less than its value as a symbol in the feud. Over time, it became a local landmark, with its origin story passed down as an example of how personal disputes could shape the city's landscape. The Boston Skinny House shows how family conflict, property rights, and urban form can collide. It also demonstrates the flexibility of 19th-century urban building laws, which left room for personal motives to be built into the physical environment. The brother who built it may have lost the bulk of the land, but he ensured that the portion he did keep would leave a lasting impact on the one who took the rest. The Schilling Spite House in Hiawatha, Kansas, came from a dispute between neighbors that went beyond harsh words. According to accounts from the late 19th century, a man named Schilling decided to make his neighbor's life unendurable. He owned a piece of land next to the neighbor's home. Instead of leaving it open or developing it in a way that fit the area's small-town layout, he put up a multi-unit tenement along the property line. In a rural community where homes often had open yards and room to breathe, this was a deliberate intrusion. The tenement blocked sunlight and fresh air, and it brought in a rotating cast of tenants right up against the neighbor's wall. The increased noise, loss of privacy, and crowding changed the character of the neighbor's property overnight. The building itself was lawful under the town's rules at the time. There were few zoning regulations in small Kansas towns in that era, and no rules about how close a residential building could be to another. The choice to build a tenement rather than a single-family home made the impact even greater. In a rural context, a multi-unit structure was rare, and its constant activity would have stood out even more. Schilling's stated or implied goal was not to make money from rents, though that was possible, but to use occupancy and building placement as a tool of harassment. In small towns, social standing and daily interactions carried a lot of weight. By creating a source of constant disruption right at the neighbor's property line, Schilling found a way to press his advantage in the feud without breaking the letter of the law. In Virginia City, Nevada, a similar dynamic played out, though the setting was different. Virginia City was a mining boomtown with a dense layout, narrow lots, and steep streets. Even so, there was still value in open space between homes for air circulation and natural light, especially in a dusty and often hot environment. A property owner there decided to build a house less than 12 inches from his neighbor's home. The gap was so narrow that it could not be used for passage. The proximity blocked the neighbor's side windows, cutting off breezes and daylight. In a town that had grown quickly around the silver mining industry, many buildings were thrown up with speed and without much central planning. Lot lines were respected, but setbacks were often absent. The law did not prevent a builder from pushing right up to the edge of his own property, even if that meant standing inches from a neighbor's wall. The result in this case was a kind of man-made canyon between two walls, trapping heat and dust. The loss of airflow would have been noticeable in summer, and the loss of light would have made parts of the neighbor's home feel closed in. In a boomtown where property values and mining fortunes shifted fast, such a move could make the neighbor's property less comfortable and possibly less valuable. Both of these cases show how spite construction could adapt to local conditions. In Hiawatha, where space was not at a premium, the spite came from crowding, where crowding was unusual. A tenement in that spot introduced noise and density that clashed with the surrounding homes. In Virginia City, where density was already common, the spite came from removing the small but important gaps that made life bearable. Building less than a foot away from an existing home turned a narrow space into a barrier for air and light, both of which were scarce commodities in a dusty, high-desert mining town. The Schilling Spite House demonstrates how the rural or small-town environment could make such actions stand out. In a place where neighbors might be used to seeing across open yards, where fences were low and houses set back from the road, a solid wall of rental units sent a strong message. It was a constant reminder of a dispute that had moved beyond words and into the built environment. Tenants came and went, but the structure stayed, pressing against the neighbor's home like permanent statement. The Virginia City case shows that even in areas with limited space, the motive behind construction can turn practical building into a weapon. A person might claim they are making the most of their lot, but the placement of walls, the blocking of windows, and the elimination of airflow point to a personal goal of making the neighbor's living conditions worse. In a boomtown, where survival often depended on being tough and self-reliant, such actions might not draw much official sympathy. Still, the effect on the targeted household would have been sharp and daily. In both towns, the absence of strong building regulations or neighbor protection laws made spite construction possible. The law generally focused on property boundaries, fire safety, and basic structural stability. As long as a building stayed within its lot and met those basic standards, it could stand, regardless of why it was built. This legal gap gave room for people to turn personal grudges into permanent physical changes to the landscape. Whether in a Kansas prairie town or a Nevada mining settlement, the Spite House became more than a home or an investment. It became a statement set in wood, brick, or stone, meant to outlast the quarrel that created it. The Richardson Spite House in New York City was the product of a failed sale that turned into an act of stubbornness. The story begins with a piece of land on the Upper West Side in the late 19th century. The owner, Joseph Richardson, wanted to sell the lot to a developer who was putting up an apartment building next door. The strip of land measured only 5 feet in depth, but ran the length of the developer's project. Richardson set a high asking price. The developer refused, arguing the land was too small to have much value and assuming Richardson would eventually lower his price. Instead, Richardson decided to build on it himself. The result was an apartment building only 5 feet deep from front to back, pressed hard against the new structure next door. The building rose several stories and contained apartments arranged in a single narrow band. Interior rooms were small, with little natural light, and the floor plans were dictated by the extreme dimensions. The front-facing rooms looked onto the street, but the back walls were so close to the neighboring building that light barely reached them. The point was not to create ideal living spaces, but to occupy the land in a way that blocked the neighbor's windows and views. In an era before modern zoning setbacks in New York, there was no rule to stop Richardson from building to the very edge of his property. The result was a wall-like barrier along the side of the developer's new building, cutting off air and light to units that had been designed to open onto the empty strip. Richardson's choice turned an unremarkable sliver of land into a permanent reminder of a negotiation gone wrong. The building stood for decades as a curiosity in the city's dense grid, and while it did house tenants, its real purpose had been to deny the developer the benefit of an unobstructed side yard. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Skinny Building has a different but related origin. In the early 20th century, the city undertook a street-widening project that cut into many private lots. One property owner was left with a narrow slice of land along the street, measuring only 5 feet wide at its narrowest point. The city offered to buy it, but the owner refused, unhappy with the compensation. Rather than sell, he decided to build. The building that went up was a narrow commercial structure, rising several stories and fronting the busy downtown street. The skinny building's layout reflected its extreme proportions. The ground floor could only fit a shallow counter for sales, with customers standing on the sidewalk while clerks worked inside. Upper floors were reached by a narrow staircase and used for offices or storage. The structure met building codes for safety and access, but it made no attempt to hide its cramped dimensions. In fact, the point was to use the land in a way that kept it in the owner's hands and denied the city the chance to merge it into the widened street or adjacent properties. The Pittsburgh case shows how spite construction can respond to public projects as well as private disputes. The street widening was meant to improve traffic flow, but it created odd, unusable shaped remnants of land. Most owners sold their fragments to the city or to neighbors. The skinny building's owner saw another option: keep the land active and visible by putting up a commercial building. The effect was to block the open sightline the city had likely expected and to hold on to a downtown address even if the space inside was barely workable. Both the Richardson Spite House and the Skinny Building relied on the same basic legal framework. In each city at the time, property owners could build up to their lot lines without mandatory setbacks, as long as they met safety and fire rules. There were no restrictions based on light or air for neighboring properties unless a specific easement existed. This allowed someone with a sliver of land to put up a vertical structure that would still count as a lawful building, even if it could not be considered spacious or efficient. The Richardson Building used its placement to alter the livability of an existing structure next door, targeting the developer who had refused to buy the lot. The Pittsburgh Building used its presence to resist a city project and keep a visible commercial footprint in the heart of downtown. In both cases, the narrowness was not a flaw, but the defining feature, turning otherwise negligible land into a tool for making a point. In New York, the apartments in the Richardson Spite House may have been difficult to rent for long-term tenants, but their existence satisfied Richardson's goal of denying his neighbor the advantage of an open side yard. In Pittsburgh, the commercial use of the Skinny Building made it more practical to keep, but the cramped interiors meant it was never going to be a high-revenue property compared to larger neighboring buildings. The economic return was secondary to the symbolic statement of not yielding land. These two examples highlight how ultra-narrow urban spite constructions can serve as both functional buildings and acts of defiance. They take advantage of the fact that in dense cities, even the smallest parcels of land can be developed if the owner is determined enough. By doing so, they change the streetscape and, in many cases, frustrate the plans of others who had counted on the space to remain open or unused. The Richardson Spite House turned a 5-foot strip into a vertical barrier between neighbors. The Skinny Building turned a sliver of post-widening land into a lasting part of Pittsburgh's downtown, ensuring the owner's presence on the street long after the city's project was complete. In the late 19th century, William Waldorf Astor and his aunt, Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor, were the leading figures in two branches of one of New York's most prominent families. Their relationship was tense. Both had wealth and social standing, but they disagreed on matters of society and status. In 1893, William decided to tear down his father's brownstone mansion on Fifth Avenue and replace it with a luxury hotel. The site was directly next to his aunt's home, and the new structure loomed over it. On the side facing her mansion, the hotel presented a largely windowless wall. The effect was imposing and deliberate, cutting off light and any pleasant view she might have enjoyed from that side of her property. At the time, Fifth Avenue was transitioning from a street of private mansions to one lined with commercial and hospitality buildings. Caroline Astor resisted this change, preferring the old arrangement of elite residences. William's decision not only defied her preferences, but also physically altered her environment. A massive, modern hotel beside her home symbolized a shift in social power. The Waldorf Hotel catered to wealthy guests and set new standards for luxury accommodation, but it also stood as a statement that William was not bound by his aunt's vision for the family's place in New York. The wall was legal, and there were no regulations requiring a building to provide light or views for neighboring properties. Without a negative easement or similar agreement, Caroline had no way to demand changes. She eventually responded by working with her son, John Jacob Astor IV, to build a matching luxury hotel on her own property. This became the Astoria Hotel, which connected to the Waldorf, forming the Waldorf-Astoria complex. Though the combined hotel was successful, the original act that started the chain of events, the construction of a high blank wall beside her home, remains an example of using architecture to make a family point in public view. More than 40 years later and thousands of miles away, a similar blending of personal motive and grand architecture took place in Buenos Aires. The Kavanaugh Building, completed in 1936, was a modernist skyscraper that dominated the skyline. Commissioned by Karina Kavanaugh, a wealthy woman without ties to the city's entrenched aristocracy, the tower rose in front of the Anchorina family's palatial home. The Anchorinas were long established and had financed the construction of the nearby Basilica del Santissimo Sacramento, a grand Catholic church. From the Anchorina Palace, there had been a direct view of the church, which stood as both a religious and social symbol for the family. According to local accounts and enduring legend, Karina Kavanaugh had once been romantically involved with a man from the Anchorina family. The relationship met with disapproval, allegedly because she was not from the same social class. After it ended, Kavanaugh bought the lot in front of the palace and commissioned the skyscraper. Its placement blocked the palace's view of the church. Whether or not the romance story is fully accurate, the fact remains that the building's height and location erased the sightline from the Anchorina residents to their favored religious landmark. The Kavanaugh Building was an architectural statement in its own right. At 120 meters, it was the tallest building in Latin America at the time. Its sleek, tiered design reflected the modernist style and the ambition of Buenos Aires in the 1930s. It offered luxury apartments with panoramic views, except, of course, to the palace it overshadowed. The positioning was precise enough to raise questions even without the social feud story. In an urban environment where open views were prized, especially toward the river and important monuments, blocking a direct line to a family's chosen landmark carried symbolic weight. Like the Waldorf, the Kavanaugh Building followed the legal rules of its city. Zoning allowed the height, and there was no law protecting a private view to a public building. The lack of such rights meant that even the most influential families could not stop a neighbor from building in a way that altered what they could see from their windows. The difference in this case was that the builder came from outside the established elite, and the skyscraper itself was a marker of new money and new influence. By placing it where she did, Kavanaugh not only gained a prime piece of real estate, but also inserted herself into the city's visual and social landscape in a way that the older families could not ignore. In both cases, the spite or defiance was scaled to the setting. On Fifth Avenue, the wall of the Waldorf Hotel was a towering reminder of a family rift, built in the language of high-end hospitality. In Buenos Aires, the Kavanaugh Building was an unmistakable vertical challenge to aristocratic dominance, using the height and mass of a skyscraper to change both the skyline and the view from a powerful family's home. Each used legal property rights and architectural scale to press a point, ensuring the dispute was not just remembered but physically embedded in the city's form. The Salem Spite House in Massachusetts began as a deliberate attempt to block a neighbor's view. Local accounts place it in the late 19th century, built when two property owners fell into a dispute over sightlines toward the harbor. The owner of the disputed lot decided to put up a building along the edge of his property, tall enough and positioned so that it cut off the neighbor's prized view. In an era without legal protections for access to light or scenery, this was entirely lawful as long as the building met safety and zoning rules of the day. The design was functional, but clearly intended to obstruct rather than enhance the area. Over time, the presence of the building strained neighborhood relations further. Threats of a lawsuit eventually followed, focused on claims of nuisance or potential damage. The cost and uncertainty of a legal fight led the builder or a later owner to demolish the structure. Its brief life and dramatic end left a local story about how quickly private disputes could reshape a street and then vanish when circumstances changed. The Collinsville Spite House in Connecticut tells a different story, though it shares the same impulse to use construction as a weapon in a neighborhood rivalry. Collinsville, a small mill town along the Farmington River, grew in the 19th century with closely spaced houses near the factories. In this setting, sunlight and open space between buildings were important to residents. A dispute between neighbors there led one of them to buy a narrow strip of land between two existing homes. Instead of leaving it open or selling it, the new owner built a narrow house right in the gap. The structure blocked sunlight to windows on both sides and removed a view corridor that had made the homes feel less crowded. The house itself was habitable, with a slender staircase and rooms stacked one behind the other, but the choice to build so close on both sides made living conditions tight. The unusual footprint drew attention, and residents understood it was more about sending a message than meeting a housing need. In a small town where people passed each other daily, such a move carried both practical effects and social weight. It turned an empty space into a permanent reminder of the disagreement. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, the O'Reilly Spite House followed yet another path to existence. A man named O'Reilly owned a small piece of land wedged between other properties in a desirable neighborhood. A developer offered to buy it to expand a larger project, but O'Reilly felt the offer was too low. When negotiations failed, he decided to build on the lot himself. The available space allowed for a building only 8 feet wide, but O'Reilly went ahead, putting up a multi-story structure that filled the lot from edge to edge. The building was narrow enough that interior layouts had to be custom fitted, and its proximity to the neighboring walls limited light. Yet it was fully legal and counted as a complete residence. The new building pressed against its neighbors and removed any chance for them to claim extra yard space or side access. O'Reilly's refusal to sell, paired with his quick construction, ensured the land would remain in his control and that the surrounding owners would have to adjust to its presence. These 3 spite houses each reflect a mix of personal grievance, local building rules, and the character of their surroundings. The Salem example shows how targeted obstruction could provoke legal threats, even if it began within the bounds of property law. Collinsville's case illustrates how filling a gap in a small-town street could disrupt light, views, and the sense of space that residents valued, magnifying the effect of the act beyond its modest dimensions. The O'Reilly case demonstrates how holding firm in a failed land sale could lead to a permanent, physical marker of a dispute in one of New England's oldest cities. In all 3 cases, the law at the time allowed property owners to build up to their lot lines and to use their land without regard to preserving a neighbor's light or view, unless a specific easement or covenant said otherwise. This legal context made it possible for personal motives to shape the physical form of a neighborhood. The results often looked unusual: narrow footprints, close quarters, abrupt walls, but they stood as lawful structures. For the builders, the satisfaction came not only from asserting their rights, but also from knowing the construction would remind others of the dispute for as long as it stood. The Alameda Spite House in California began with a dispute over land taken for a road. In the early 20th century, the city seized part of a property to expand the street network. The owner received compensation, but he felt the payment was far too low. What remained of his lot was small and oddly shaped, wedged against the new street. Rather than sell it or leave it empty, he built a home that seemed designed as much to make a point as to serve a practical need. The structure rose over the sidewalk on a cantilevered frame, projecting out from the narrow base to create more interior space. The design allowed the building to claim airspace above the public walkway while keeping within the property boundaries. This unusual form blocked sightlines along the street and made a clear visual statement to the city and neighbors. It was a constant reminder of the owner's dissatisfaction with the way his land had been handled. Cantilevered buildings were not common in Alameda's residential neighborhoods at the time. Most homes followed standard setbacks and sat fully on their lots. By projecting over the sidewalk, The spite house broke the rhythm of the street and gave the appearance of pressing into public space, even though it was built within the legal envelope allowed. The house's scale and position made it impossible to ignore. For passersby, it was a curiosity. For the owner, it was a physical way to challenge the outcome of the road project. The building's persistence showed how spite construction could adapt to the constraints of an altered lot, using creative engineering to maximize the statement without breaking the law. In Seattle's Montlake neighborhood, the so-called Montlake Spite House took shape on a triangular plot of land. The lot's shape came from the intersection of two streets at an acute angle, leaving a narrow wedge of land between them. A local account holds that the owner of a larger neighboring property once tried to buy the plot at a low price, expecting the owner would have no use for it. Offended by the offer, the seller decided to keep the land and build on it instead. The resulting house was narrow at the street-facing end, less than 5 feet wide, and widened toward the back, following the lot's shape. The floor plan reflected the geometry of the lot. At the narrow end, interior spaces were only wide enough for a hallway and small seating area. Farther back, rooms opened up slightly, but the overall footprint remained compact. The design fit the property exactly, with no wasted space, and met building regulations for setbacks and safety. From the street, the sharp end of the house looked almost like a wall, and its unusual proportions made it stand out among the neighborhood's more conventional homes. The placement had another effect. It blocked the neighbor's view across the wedge toward the intersection and beyond. In a residential district where open sight lines and sunlight through side windows were valued, this was a notable change. The act of building on the lot transformed it from an overlooked corner of land into a permanent structure that altered how the adjacent property felt and functioned. The neighbor who had once seen the plot as worthless now had to live beside a building that not only filled the space, but also called attention to the failed sale. The Alameda and Montlake examples both show how spite houses on the West Coast and in the Pacific Northwest could use irregular lots to their advantage. In Alameda, the cantilever turned a narrow leftover strip into a full building footprint, pressing into the visual space of the street. In Seattle, the triangular plan allowed the builder to turn a plot that seemed impractical into a pointed, both literally and figuratively, response to a low offer. In both cases, the structures were legal and habitable, yet their proportions and positioning made it clear they were built with a personal motive in mind. West Coast cities in the early and mid-20th century often had building codes that focused on safety, fire risk, and structural stability. There were few rules designed to protect neighboring light, views, or openness, especially in residential neighborhoods without formal covenants. This legal context allowed property owners to develop small or awkward parcels without regard for how the resulting structures might affect others nearby. When personal disputes or resentment were involved, this freedom could produce buildings that stood out sharply from their surroundings. In Alameda, the cantilever gave the owner a way to create a functional living space despite the loss of much of his lot. But it also sent a message to the city that the road seizure was not forgiven. In Montlake, the decision to build rather than sell turned an awkward wedge into a landmark of defiance, one that made the neighbor's offer look short-sighted in hindsight. In both places, the houses remain part of local lore, illustrating how property disputes, no matter how small in scale, can leave lasting marks on the physical and visual character of a neighborhood. In the village of Gainford in northern England, the Edleston Spite House came from a dispute over a public monument. In the early 19th century, Joseph Edleston offered to fund a memorial for his late wife to be placed in a prominent spot in the village. The local council rejected his proposal, whether out of personal friction, aesthetic objections, or local politics. Edleston took the refusal as an insult. In response, he purchased land facing the area where the monument would have stood and built a house with an unusual feature, a 40-foot column rising from the property. The column stood as his own personal memorial, dominating the view and making sure the village could not ignore it. The house itself was respectable and in keeping with local style, but the towering column broke the visual line of the street and drew attention to Edliston's defiance. By turning private property into a stage for his message, he ensured the council's decision would be countered in the most public way possible. In Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Sarajevo Spite House was born from a land dispute with the city. The government wanted the land where a man's home stood to build a new city hall during the Austro-Hungarian period. The owner refused to sell, but the authorities insisted, eventually offering a trade. They would give him land on the other side of the Miljacka River in exchange. He agreed on one condition: his home would be moved, brick by brick, to the new site. The house was carefully dismantled and reconstructed across the river, in full view of its original location. This was more than a practical relocation. It was a deliberate statement that the owner's home would not simply vanish because the government wanted the land. From its new position, the house stood as a reminder to city officials and residents of the forced move. It turned a municipal project into a personal challenge, showing that even if the building changed places, the owner's will and presence remained. In Beirut, Lebanon, the building known as Al-Bassa, Arabic for the grudge, is one of the most striking examples of spite-shaping architecture. The story goes that two brothers inherited land near the waterfront. One brother acquired most of it, while the other received only a narrow wedge-shaped piece. When the brothers fell out, the one with the smaller lot decided to make the most of it by blocking his sibling's sea view. The result was a building so narrow that, from some angles, it looks like a single wall. It stretches along the edge of the property, rising high enough to cut off the view from the larger building behind it. The wedge-shaped design follows the outline of the lot, narrowing to only a few feet at one end. Inside, rooms are cramped, and the building's value as living space is limited, but it fulfills its intended function perfectly, removing a coveted view from the reach of its owner's rival. All three examples use architectural form to answer personal or political disputes, but each does so in a way that reflects its cultural and historical setting. The Edliston case took place in a small English village, where a 40-foot column would dominate the skyline and stand out against the low buildings. In that context, the column was as much a public statement as any monument the council might have approved. By tying it to his home, Edliston ensured no one could separate the memorial from his own act of defiance. In Sarajevo, the relocation of the Spite House turned an act of municipal authority into a lasting public memory. The choice to move the house intact, rather than simply build a new one, showed a dedication to preserving not just the structure, but its identity. Anyone crossing the river could see the house in its new spot and understand it was the same one taken from the city hall site. This gave it a dual role: a functioning home and a standing protest. In Beirut, Al-Bassa uses extreme proportions as its statement. In a city with valuable coastal views, blocking access to them can significantly affect property value and prestige. By building a narrow vertical barrier that was still technically a habitable building, the owner took advantage of property rights to create a lasting obstacle. The shape itself, sharply tapered, with no wasted space, speaks to the precision of the intent. It is an act of geometry as much as construction, ensuring that the maximum blockage came from the minimum possible footprint. The legal context in each location allowed these spite structures to stand. In Gainford, there were no regulations to stop a property owner from erecting a column on his land. In Sarajevo, the agreement with the city made the relocation lawful, even if the motive was to remind them of the dispute. In Beirut, zoning and property boundaries were respected, even if the result was a building with little traditional utility. This adherence to the rules gave each builder protection from being forced to remove the structure. Each building also altered the visual and social fabric of its surroundings. The Edliston column drew the eye and reshaped the village's skyline. The Sarajevo Spite House became part of the view across the river, changing the way people experienced the city center. Al-Bassa turned an open sightline to the sea into a blank wall, changing how both residents and passersby experienced the street. These were not hidden acts. They were meant to be seen, discussed, and remembered. In Farnham, Surrey, a modern house became a flashpoint in a planning dispute that some locals viewed as an act of architectural defiance. Approved in 2017 for a hillside plot, the design called for a contemporary home set within strict height, location, and materials guidelines. As construction progressed, neighbors claimed it no longer matched the approved plans. They said it was taller, set further forward, and built with materials that made it look like stacked shipping containers. Some objectors believed the deviations were intentional, altering the visual impact on surrounding homes. Over 170 complaints were filed, and the council issued a demolition order. The owner appealed, and the planning inspector allowed modifications instead of complete removal. The case showed how in modern Britain, even when a building breaches planning conditions, the process to address it can be slow and contentious. While the motives behind the changes were never legally defined as spite, the public reaction reflected the same tension seen in classic spite house cases, perceived disregard for neighbors' interests, combined with a willingness to push the limits of what is allowed. In Brooklyn, New York, a different kind of targeted construction emerged, sometimes called a spite church. Under New York State's liquor licensing law, known as the 200-foot rule, the state liquor authority cannot grant a license to sell alcohol for on-site consumption to any business located within 200 feet of a building used exclusively as a school or place of worship. In practice, this has meant that a church opening in a specific location can prevent a bar or restaurant nearby from serving liquor. In at least one Brooklyn case from the early 20th century, a small church building appeared on a contested lot after a bar owner sought a license. Local accounts suggest it was built less for religious needs than to trigger the liquor restriction, effectively blocking the bar from operating as intended. The building met the requirements for classification as a place of worship, which was enough to invoke the rule. Even if services were minimal, the structure achieved its goal, changing the economic and social use of nearby properties by making alcohol sales impossible. While these modern and quasi-modern cases share the spirit of older spite houses, they exist in a different legal environment. Planning laws in the UK now include extensive public consultation, design approval stages, and enforcement tools. Breaching these can lead to demolition or costly alterations, as in Farnham, but proving motive is not part of the process. Planners focus on compliance rather than intent. In the United States, building codes, zoning ordinances, and land use laws restrict how and where structures can be built. The spite church approach works not because the building defies code, but because it uses existing law strategically. The motive may be personal or competitive, but the method exploits a legal trigger rather than breaking a regulation. Psychological motives in these cases often overlap with those in historical spite constructions, a desire to assert control, retaliate for perceived wrongs, or prevent others from benefiting from a situation. For some builders, the act is about reclaiming a sense of power in a dispute. In Farnham, residents believed the altered design asserted the owner's vision over community standards. In Brooklyn, a spite church asserts a veto over a neighbor's business by invoking moral and legal authority. In both, the result changes the surrounding environment in a way that is hard to reverse. Community fallout can be lasting. In Farnham, the disagreement over the building deepened divisions between neighbors, with some defending the design as modern architecture and others seeing it as an eyesore and a breach of trust. The extended enforcement process kept the controversy in local headlines. In Brooklyn, the insertion of a church into a commercial block could reshape the local economy, alter foot traffic, and change the balance between residential, religious, and nightlife uses. Even if the initial motive fades, the functional impact remains. Modern building codes limit spite construction in ways that were not present in the 19th or early 20th century. Setback requirements, height limits, design review boards, and environmental assessments reduce the chance that a building can be placed purely to block light or views. Many jurisdictions also have nuisance laws or rights of light statutes that could be used against extreme spite structures. In England, for example, the Housing and Planning Act 2016 allows local authorities to override certain easements, but rights of light claims can still be made if a building significantly blocks daylight to a neighbor's windows. In the United States, Cities can require shadow studies for tall buildings, and variances are often needed for unusual lot use. These mechanisms do not eliminate spite building, but raise the costs and risks for anyone attempting it. Despite these controls, the spirit behind spite construction persists. Whether in the form of a house that grows beyond its approved footprint or a place of worship placed to limit a neighbor's liquor license, the core idea is the same: using a legal structure to exert influence over others. The results can be as visible as a looming wall on a hillside, or as subtle as a zoning restriction that changes the way a street functions. In either form, they show that even in a world of tight building regulation, personal motives can still find expression in brick, steel, and glass.